She tossed her bandbox into the arms of the broad-shouldered man in the stable yard before she had properly looked at his face and said, "Hold that, would you, and mind the ribbon. It's the only good thing I own." The man caught it against his chest, and the broad-shouldered man who caught it had not smiled in 7 years. She could not have known that. No one had told her, walking up from the village, that the master of this house had worn his grief like weather for 7 years, and that the whole household had forgotten the sound of his laughter. She saw only a pair of strong arms and a damp linen shirt. He had been carrying a saddle across the cobbles, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and now he stood holding a battered bandbox tied with a single, faded green ribbon, as though someone had handed him a live bird. Eleanor Hart did not notice the way the two grooms by the water trough went very still.
She did not notice that the undergardener, halfway up a ladder against the south wall, stopped clipping. She was 26 years old. She had walked the last mile and a half from the village because the carrier had set her down at the wrong gate, and she had precisely one thought, which was that her arms ached, and here was a strong pair of arms doing nothing useful. "Ravenstone," she said, pushing a loose chestnut curl out of her eyes. "This is Ravenstone, isn't it? Please say it is, because if I've walked all this way to the wrong house, I shall simply lie down in that flower bed and let the lilacs have me." The man looked at the lilac head she had waved at, a long dark wall of it, the buds still tight and green, not yet broken into bloom. And then he looked back at her. He had grey eyes, the cool grey of a sky that has not decided whether to clear. He did not smile. He had not smiled, though she could not have known it, in 7 years. The household had stopped expecting it, the way one stops expecting snow in June. "It is Ravenstone," he said. His voice startled her. It was not a groom's voice. It was low and exact, each word set down with care, the voice of a man who had been taught Latin by someone who beat the tables into him. But his hands, when she glanced at them, were a working man's hands, broad across the knuckle, a callus ridged along the right palm, a scab healing at the base of one thumb. She filed the contradiction away, the way she filed most things, quickly and without ceremony, and decided it did not matter. "Thank heaven." She bent and seized the larger of her two trunks by its rope handle, and got it perhaps 4 inches off the ground, before her arms informed her, in the plainest terms, that this was not going to happen. She set it down. She straightened. She regarded the man holding her bandbox. "Well," she said, "I don't suppose you'd consider being heroic about the trunk." For a moment he did not move, and she thought she had offended him. Perhaps grooms at great houses stood on their dignity. She wouldn't know. She'd never been at a great house in her life. Then he set her bandbox down on the mounting block with a gentleness that did not match his size, crossed the yard, and lifted the trunk that had defeated her as though it held feathers and not the entire material sum of her life. "Where?" he said. "The governess's rooms, I should think. I'm the governess." She put out her hand, because that was what her father had taught her to do with every soul she met, gentle or simple, and her father had been a vicar and right about most things. "Eleanor Hart. Now, if there's no one stiff about to hear it. I've come for Lady Clara." He looked at her offered hand. Something moved behind the grey eyes, quick and gone, like a fish turning in deep water. Then he shifted the trunk to one shoulder, freeing his right hand, and took hers. His grip was warm and dry and careful. "Ashby," he said. "Mr. Ashby." She smiled at him, the wide, unguarded smile that her last employer had told her was unbecoming in a woman of her station, as though a smile cost the gentry something. "There, now we're acquainted, and you can tell me whether the child bites." "She does not bite." "That's something. The last one bit." Mel picked up her bandbox and fell into step beside him as he carried the trunk toward the great grey house. And because she had been alone with her own thoughts on the road for the better part of 2 hours, and was constitutionally unable to bear silence when a person was standing right there inside it, she talked. She told him the carrier had a horse named Bishop, who would not pass a white gate. She told him she had eaten her last apple at the milestone and was now prepared to commit small crimes for a cup of tea. She told him the house looked like it was holding its breath. She did not notice, because she was not looking for it, but the man beside her said nothing at all, and that the saying of nothing seemed, in him, to be a thing with weight, a held door, not an empty room. Julian Ashcombe, 9th Duke of Ravenstone, carried the governess's trunk to the servant's door of his own house, and did not tell her who he was. He could not, afterward, have said exactly why. He told himself it was the simplest path. She would learn it within the hour from the first footman who crossed her, and there was no sense making a scene of it in the yard. But that was not the truth, and he was a man who had spent 7 years being scrupulous with himself about the truth, because it was the only discipline grief had left him. The truth was that she had handed him her bandbox. She had handed him her bandbox and asked him to be heroic about a trunk and called the only good thing she owned a faded green ribbon. And in 7 years, not one living soul had looked at him and seen a pair of strong arms doing nothing useful. They saw the black armband he no longer wore. They saw the Duke, who did not dine in company, who rode out before the household woke so that the grooms need not arrange their faces, who had let the music room be locked because he could not walk past the door of it. They saw a sorrow wearing a man's coat. This woman, mud to the hem, had seen a groom and had been rude to him, and the rudeness had gone through him like the first warm day after a long frost, almost painful, the warmth coming back into a limb gone numb. So he carried her trunk, and he held his tongue, and at the servant's door he set the trunk down, and Mrs. Pell, the housekeeper, opened it, and went white to the lips at the sight of him standing there in his shirt-sleeves, with the governess chattering at his elbow. "You're—" Mrs. Pell began. "Mrs. Pell will see you settled," the Duke said, fast, before the word could land. "Miss Hart has come for Lady Clara." Mrs. Pell, who had been in service at Ravenston for 30 years, and had buried a duchess and watched a duke turn to stone, looked at her master's face. Whatever she saw there made her close her mouth on the title. "This way, miss," she said faintly. Nell turned on the threshold. "Thank you, Mr. Ashby," she said. "You've saved my arms, and possibly my soul. If they ever let you near the teapot, I'll be in your debt forever." And the Duke of Ravenston, standing in the yard of the house his grief had governed for 7 years, inclined his head to the new governess, and felt the corner of his mouth do something it had forgotten how to do. He caught it before it finished. But it had moved. He turned and walked back to the stables, with the strange, unsteady feeling of a man who has stepped on a stair that was not there, and he did not understand it, and he did not, for the first time in a very long while, entirely hate the day. The house, Mel decided within her first 3 hours, was the saddest, beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was beautiful the way a frozen lake is beautiful. Everything in it was perfect, and nothing in it was alive. The long gallery had portraits enough to people a small town, and dust sheets on half the furniture, and a silence so complete that her own footsteps embarrassed her. The servants moved through it like people in a sick room. When she laughed at something, the cat asleep in a suit of armor, its tail hanging out of the visor, the parlour-maid, dusting nearby, flinched as though laughter were a dropped plate. "Does no one ever make a noise here?" Nell asked. The maid, whose name was Susan, and who was 17 and frightened of everything, looked at her with round eyes. "Not above stairs, miss. His Grace—" She stopped. "His Grace doesn't care for noise." "His Grace doesn't care for anything, miss," Susan whispered, and then went scarlet and fled with her duster, leaving Nell standing in the great cold gallery, with a sentence she would not understand for some time. She found Lady Clara in the schoolroom at the top of the east wing, which was the one warm room she had yet encountered, because someone, Mrs. Pell, she would later learn, had ordered fires kept there regardless of the household's general air of mourning. The child was 7 years old. She was sitting under the table.
"Hello,"
said Nell, and got down on her knees on the hearthrug so that her face was on a level with the child's, which was a thing her father had taught her. Never address a small person from a great height, for the world is tall enough to them already. "I'm Miss Hart. I've come to be your governess. Why are we under the table?" Lady Clara considered her. She had her father's grey eyes, Nell would think later, though she did not yet know to think it. And she had a fierce, small chin, and a great quantity of dark hair, badly plaited by someone who did not love her enough to do it properly. "The last one didn't get under the table," Clara said. "She sat in the chair and read about kings." "The last one sounds dull as a wet Sunday." A flicker, not a smile. This was a house, Mel was beginning to see, where smiles were rationed like wartime sugar. But a flicker. "She bit me," Clara offered. "I mean, I bit her." "So I heard. Was she worth biting?" Clara thought about this with great seriousness. "No," she admitted. "She tasted of starch." And Nell laughed. Really laughed. The sound of it filling the warm schoolroom and rolling out into the cold corridor beyond. And Lady Clara Ashcombe, who had been 7 years old in a house of held breath for the whole of her remembered life, came out from under the table to see what the noise was, because she had never in her life heard anyone laugh as though they meant it. By the end of the first week, Nell had 3 certainties and 100 questions. The certainties were these. First, that Lady Clara was lonely in the specific, marrow-deep way of a child who has been clothed and fed and taught and never once held. And that this was a wound Nell intended to do something about, position or no position. Second, that the master of the house was a ghost. Mel had been at Ravenston 7 days and had not laid eyes on the Duke, who took his meals alone, rode out before dawn, and conducted whatever business a duke conducts behind doors that closed softly when she approached. And third, this was the one that nagged, that the kind groom from the stable yard, Mr. Ashby, was a man of strange and inconsistent station. She kept meeting him. That was the first oddity. A groom ought to be in the stables, but she met Mr. Ashby in the library, where she had gone to find a book about the kings of England that did not taste of starch, and he was standing at the window, with a ledger in his hands and the morning light on his face. And he had looked up at her, with that quick, deep-water movement behind the eyes, and said, "The histories are on the second shelf, the dull ones. If you want the one with the murders in it, it is behind the Latin, where the last governess could not reach it." "You read murders, Mr. Ashby?" "I read everything," he had said. "There is a great deal of time here." And she had taken the book about the murders and gone away puzzling over a groom who knew where the good histories were hidden and said there is a great deal of time here, the way a prisoner might say it. That was the second oddity, the way he talked. The third was that the servants, who feared the very air of the house, did not fear him exactly, but arranged themselves around him with a wary attention that Nell could not account for. When he came into a room, the footman straightened. When he left, they breathed. She watched the under-butler nearly drop a tray of glasses one morning because Mr. Ashby had come up behind him unannounced, and the man's "beg pardon" had had a quaver in it entirely out of proportion to a groom. "He's an odd one, your Mr. Ashby," she told Mrs. Pell, helping her fold linen in the still-room, because Nell had discovered early that the way to learn a house was to make yourself useful in its working rooms. Mrs. Pell's hands went still on the sheet. "Is he, miss? Talks like a bishop, reads like a scholar, lifts like an ox. Half the men in this house jump when he so much as clears his throat." Nell shook out a pillow slip. "What is he, exactly? Steward? Some sort of upper man?" There was a silence in the still-room that went on a beat too long. Mrs. Pell looked at the linen in her hands as though she had forgotten what it was for. "He's been here all his life, miss," the housekeeper said at last, which was true, and was also not an answer. And Nell, who was sharp and had noticed the not answer, opened her mouth to press it. And the door opened, and Mr. Ashby came in with rain on the shoulders of his coat. A proper coat now, dark and well cut. And Nell thought there, you see, an upper servant after all. They give the senior men decent coats. And she lost her question in the simple pleasure of seeing him, which she did not examine because she was not in the habit of examining the things that made a gray day better. "Mrs. Pell," he said, "the east chimney is smoking into Lady Clara's schoolroom. I have spoken to the sweep. It will be seen to tomorrow." Then, to Nell, with that exactness that always sounded like a man translating from some colder language into a warmer one, "You should not let her sit so near it. The flu is bad." "You've been spying on my schoolroom, Mr. Ashby." I passed the door. "You pass a great many doors, for a groom." Something happened in his face. Just for a moment, the gray eyes lit, the way a banked fire lights when you open the grate, and she saw, with a small private jolt, that he was younger than she had thought, and handsomer, and that under the stone of him there was a man who had once been quick. "I am a great passer of doors," he agreed gravely. "It is my chief accomplishment." And Nell laughed, and Mrs. Pell made a small sound that might have been a sob or a swallowed word, and the man who was not a groom looked at the laughing governess as though she were a window someone had opened in a room that had been shut up for a very long time. He knew he should end it. He knew it the way one knows a debt is owed, constantly, dully, without doing anything about it. Every morning he rode out before the house woke and told himself that today he would have Mrs. Pell tell her, or he would tell her himself, plainly, "I am Ravenstone. I beg your pardon for the deception. It was unworthy." And every day he did not, because every day she handed him another small, ordinary rudeness like the bandbox in the yard, and he could not bring himself to close the window. She argued with him about the kings of England. She had opinions, fierce and ill-informed, and frequently correct by instinct where the histories were wrong by record. She corrected his Latin once, in the library, reading over his shoulder a tag he had pronounced, the old hard way his tutor had drilled into him, and she had said the soft, new way, and then gone scarlet and said, "I beg your pardon. My father was a vicar. He'd have had my ears. Who am I to correct her?" And stopped, because she did not know what to call him, and he had not helped her. She brought warmth into rooms, the way other people brought candles. He found himself arranging his days, his careful ducal days that had been arranged for 7 years, around the avoidance of feeling, around the chance of crossing her path. The east corridor at 11, when she took Clara to the long gallery to look at the rain. The still room in the afternoon. The library, where she now came openly, having decided that a house with this many books and this few readers could spare a governess a corner. And his daughter was laughing. That was the thing that undid him in the end. Not the governess's smile, though that was a wound that would not close, but the sound of his daughter laughing through a closed door. He had stood in the cold corridor outside the schoolroom one grey afternoon and heard Clara laugh, and the sound had gone into him like a blade, because he had not heard it in so long that he had forgotten the particular shape of it, which was her mother's, exactly her mother's. And he had stood there with his hand flat against the door, and his breath gone ragged, and understood that for 7 years he had not only failed to smile, he had refused his daughter the right to. He had wrapped the whole house in his mourning like a shroud, and made a 7-year-old wear it. He took his hand from the door. He did not go in. But that night, for the first time in 7 years, the Duke of Ravenston did not dine alone. He sent word to the schoolroom that Lady Clara and Miss Hart might dine in the small parlour, where there was a better fire, and he sat in his study with the door open a crack, and listened to the distant sound of a child being happy in his house. And he wept, which he had not done since the funeral, and was not ashamed. The deception broke, when it broke, on the worst possible afternoon, in the worst possible way, and it was the dowager who broke it. Augusta, Dowager Duchess of Ravenston, arrived from London without warning on a Thursday in the third week of April, in a travelling coach the colour of a bruise, with 2 outriders and a lady's maid, and the settled intention of saving her son from himself.
She was 61 years old and had been beautiful all her life, and was beautiful still, in the cold architectural way of a cathedral. She wore deep violet silk and grey kid gloves, and an expression that had ended more conversations than the plague. She had buried a husband and a daughter-in-law, and watched her only living son turn to granite. And she had decided, over the long London winter, that enough was enough. The estate wanted an heir. Julian was 28 and not getting younger. There was a girl, Lady Seraphina Vane, the Earl of Carlisle's daughter, beautiful, well-dowered, cold as Julian himself, and therefore, the dowager reasoned, perfectly suited to him. And the dowager had come to Ravenstone to arrange the future, whether the future liked it or not. She swept into the great hall, drew off her gloves finger by finger, and found her grandchild's governess crossing the gallery with a child on her hip and a smudge of jam on her cheek, both of them laughing.
The dowager stopped. She looked at the jam. She looked at the child, her grandchild, whom she had not seen smile in the whole of the infant's life, sitting on the hip of a servant as though servants were for sitting on. She looked at the governess, who had the unpardonable healthy bloom of a woman who has been happy, and who was, the dowager noted with the swift cruelty of her class, far too pretty to be left in a house with a widowed duke. "Put the child down," said the dowager. Nell put the child down. Something in the voice told her to, before her mind had finished deciding. Clara's small hand found hers and gripped. "You are the governess." "I am, Your Grace." Mel had worked it out from the violet silk and the outriders, and the way the whole house had gone, somehow even more silent.
She dropped a curtsy that was correct to the inch. Her father had drilled her in courtesy as he had drilled her in Latin. You may be poor, Nell, but you need never be ill-bred. Eleanor Hart, you will not carry my granddaughter about the house like a parcel. You will not let her appear in company with food upon her person, and you will not— The dowager's eyes went over Nell once more, head to hem, and what she saw there evidently decided something. You will not grow comfortable here. Where is my son? And it was at that moment, that exact moment, that the door of the library opened down the gallery and the Duke of Ravenstone came out with a ledger in his hand and said, in the warm, careful voice Nell had come to know better than she had any business knowing it, "Mother, you might have written." And Nell turned and saw the dowager's whole granite face soften with relief at the sight of him, and heard the word son, and saw the man she had called Mr. Ashby, for 3 weeks standing in his own gallery being greeted as the master of the house, and felt the floor of the world tilt very slowly under her feet. "Mr. Ashby," she said. It came out almost steady. He looked at her. The relief in his face curdled into something else. Dread, naked and immediate. The dread of a man who has heard the ice crack under his own boots. "Miss Hart," he said. "I can explain." "His name," said the dowager, with the bright, pitiless courtesy of a woman who has just understood a great many things and intends to use every one of them, "is Julian Ashcombe. He is the 9th Duke of Ravenstone." "Ashby," she repeated, tasting it, looking from her son's stricken face to the governess's white one, with dawning, delighted comprehension. "How charming. I see you have been making yourself very much at home, Miss Hart." Nell did not faint, because she had never fainted in her life, and was not going to begin in front of a woman in violet silk. She did the arithmetic instead, fast and merciless, the way she did everything. The library, the Latin, the good histories behind the Latin. There is a great deal of time here. The footmen straightening, the under-butlers quaver, Mrs. Pell going white at the servant's door. He's been here all his life, miss. Every contradiction she had filed away and decided did not matter, sliding now into a single, unbearable shape. That she had been rude to a duke in his own yard, had ordered a duke to be heroic about her trunk, had teased him and argued with him and corrected his Latin and laughed in his face, had let her guard all the way down with a man she thought safely beneath the notice of the gentry. And he had let her. He had stood there in his shirt sleeves and let her make a fool of herself for 3 weeks for sport. The great bored duke amusing himself with the new governess the way one amuses oneself with a dog that does tricks. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. That was the worst of it, later, that it had been so level. "I did not know you. I'll know you now." And she picked up Lady Clara, because the child was frightened, and the child mattered more than her own scalded pride. And she carried her out of the gallery, past the dowager, and past the duke, without looking at either of them. And behind her, she heard the dowager say, in a voice rich with satisfaction, "Well, Julian, we have a great deal to discuss." He came to the schoolroom that night. She knew his knock now. She had spent 3 weeks learning the textures of him without knowing what she was learning, and she almost did not open the door. But Clara was asleep at last, finally asleep after an hour of, "Is Miss Hart going away? Everyone goes away," and Nell would not have the child wake to raised voices. So she came out into the cold corridor and shut the schoolroom door behind her and faced the Duke of Ravenston in the light of the single candle he carried. And she folded her hands in front of her and said nothing, because she had learned in a hard school that the one who speaks first in an argument with the gentry has already lost. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A real one, not the kind that costs nothing." He set the candle down on the corridor table. In its light, his face was not the granite face from the gallery. It was the face from the library window, tired and young and stripped. "I should have told you who I was in the yard, inside the first minute. I knew it then, and I have known it every day since, and I did not do it. And there is no version of that which is not contemptible. So, I am sorry. Not for who I am, for letting you go on not knowing it." It was a good apology. That was almost the worst thing about it. But it was so exactly the apology she would have wanted, if she could have borne to want anything from him. She held on to her anger the way she had held the doorframe in worse rooms than this. "Why?" she said. "You may as well tell me that, since you've nothing left to lose with me. Why let it go on? What was the sport in it?" "There was no sport." He said it fast, and then, seeing she did not believe him, how could she believe him? He made a sound that was almost a laugh, the bitter end of one. "You think I was amusing myself? The bored duke and the dancing governess. Weren't you? Miss Hart." He looked at her. The grey eyes in the candlelight were not cool now. They were open all the way down, and what was at the bottom of them frightened her more than the dowager's whole armory. "In 7 years, you are the first person in this house, in this life, who has looked at me and not seen a grave. Do you understand what that is? To a man who has been a grave for 7 years. You handed me your bandbox. You told me to be heroic about a trunk. You were rude to me." His voice cracked on the word, on the small, absurd word, and he mastered it. "And I was a man again, for the length of a yard, instead of a tomb that people are sorry for. I knew it was wrong. I knew every hour it grew more wrong. And I could not put out the one warm thing in 7 years of cold. That is not an excuse. It is only the truth, which is all I have ever had to offer, and which has never once been enough." The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere below, a clock she had learned the sound of struck the half hour. "That's a terrible reason," Nell said. Her voice was not level anymore. "It's a selfish, cowardly, terrible reason." She drew a breath. "It's the only one I'd have believed. Which makes it worse, Your Grace, not better. Because now I can't even comfortably hate you, and I should so very much have liked to." And the Duke of Ravenstone, for the second time in 7 years, and the second time in 3 weeks, felt the corner of his mouth move. He did not catch it this time. It was not a smile. It was the ruin of one, half grief, and half something that had no business living in the same face as grief. But Nell saw it, and saw what it cost, and understood for the first time the true size of what she had stumbled into in that stable yard, which was not a duke playing a game, but a drowning man who had grabbed the first warm hand that came near the water. "Good night, Your Grace," she said, more gently than she meant to. "Good night, Miss Hart." A pause. "It was Ashby, my middle name. I did not lie to you about my name. It seemed important at the time that I had not lied about my name. I cannot now think why." "Go to bed, Julian," she said, and only realized when his head came up sharply, when she saw the word land in him like a stone into still water, that she had used his Christian name, that she had no right to it, that it had simply come up out of her, the way the truth comes up out of a tired person. And she fled into the schoolroom and shut the door before either of them could do anything about it. After that, by unspoken treaty, they began again. Honestly, this time, which was harder. It was harder because the lie had been a kind of holiday from Station, and Station, restored, sat between them in every room like a third person with very strict views. He was the Duke of Ravenstone. She was Lady Clara's governess, a vicar's portionless daughter, a woman who could be dismissed with a fortnight's wages and a character reference if she displeased the family. There could be nothing between them but the schoolroom and the books, and they both knew it. And they were both, Nell with fury, the Duke with a kind of grim wonder, entirely unable to stop wanting more of each other's company than the schoolroom and the books could honestly account for. So they were careful. They were so careful. They met over Clara, which was permitted. A father might take an interest in his daughter's education, and if the father's interest in his daughter's education kept the father in the schoolroom for an hour past any reasonable need, the servants who saw it said nothing, because the servants had watched the master come back from the grave, and would not have informed on the resurrection for a year's wages. It was in one of those careful schoolroom hours, with Clara asleep over a half-copied page of Latin, that he asked her why she had left her last post. Not idly, but with the plain directness she had come to expect of him, a man who set every question down like a stone and waited. She had not meant to tell him, but he had been honest with her in the corridor, at a cost she had seen on his face, and honesty, she was learning, was a debt that wanted paying in kind. So she told him, low and flat, the way she told everything that hurt, that the master of the house had made advances she declined, and that the wife, when it came out, had dismissed the woman rather than the husband, as wives were taught to, and that Nell had walked out of that house with a character reference written through gritted teeth and a fortnight's wages, and the cold, private knowledge that the unpleasantness had not been hers. He had listened without moving, and when she finished, he had said only, "Then they were fools, and you are well out of it," in a voice gone very quiet. The quiet she would later learn the footman feared. And she had thought no more of it, because she did not know yet what a man like Julian Ashcombe did with the thing entrusted to him. And the house began to thaw. It happened the way the snow goes off the north face of a hill, not all at once, not anywhere a person could point to and say, "There, that is the hour it changed," but in 100 small, unbankable mercies that one only noticed afterward, looking back. The hall clock, which had been allowed to wind down to a thick funereal tock years before, was set going properly again, and its quicker pulse changed the sound of the whole ground floor. The covers came off 2 of the long-windowed rooms on the south front,
and the maids, dusting where they had not dusted in living memory, found the light pouring in across floors that had forgotten the color of it and left the shutters folded back without anyone telling them they might. Susan began to sing in the scullery, softly at first, ready to stop, and then, when no thunderbolt came, not softly at all. Cook, emboldened, sent up a pudding with a face drawn on it in currants for Lady Clara's supper, and the footman who carried it was seen to be grinning when he came back down, and nobody scolded him for it. The servants, who had spent 7 years arranging their own faces against the master's grief, the way one walks quietly past a sick room, discovered by degrees that they need not. They could laugh in the back passages now, and not flinch when a door opened. Mrs. Pell, who had held the household together through the long frost by sheer unbending will, found her shoulders coming down from around her ears for the first time since the young Duchess had been carried out of the house, and was heard, once, humming a hymn over the linen, and pretended, when Nell caught her at it, that she had been doing no such thing. The very dogs seemed to understand it. The old spaniel, that had lain 7 years by a cold study hearth, began to pad up the east stairs in the afternoons to lie outside the schoolroom door, where the warmth and the noise and the smell of toast were, and where a child's voice rose and fell over Latin and laughter all the long, bright afternoons. None of them spoke of it directly, because they were English and in service, and it was not their place to remark upon the resurrection of a great house. But every one of them, from the steward to the boot boy, knew the shape of what was happening, and knew the chestnut-haired governess with the warm laugh and the stout country boots was at the centre of it, and quietly, fiercely to a soul, took her side in a war that had not yet been declared. It was Clara who pulled them into it mostly. Clara who decided, with the ruthless logic of 7, that if Papa would come to the schoolroom, then the schoolroom was the best place in the house, and everything good must happen there. Clara, who demanded the music room be opened.
Miss Hart plays, Papa. She plays the song Susan sings in the kitchen. Why is the music room always locked? It's the biggest room and nobody's in it. That's stupid.
And Nell had seen the Duke's face close like a slammed shutter, had seen the avoided topic surface raw in front of the child, and had got down on her knees and redirected the small tyrant with a story about a cat in a suit of armour before the wound could bleed in front of her. But that night, the Duke had come to the schoolroom and stood at the window a long time, and finally said to the dark glass, not to her. It was hers. The music room. She played. I have not been able to. He stopped. Clara does not remember her. She was lost when Clara was a year old. A fever. I was in London. Each fact set down like a stone, the way he set everything down. I had her letter telling me she was ill, and I thought, it was the season, there was a vote. I thought a fever was a fever. I thought I would go at the end of the week. She slipped away on the Wednesday. I had not gone. That is the whole of it. There is no villain in it. Only a man who thought there would be more time, and a room with a pianoforte in it that I have not been able to open for 7 years. Nell did not say it was not your fault, because it was, a little. Not the fever, but the not going, the assumption of more time. And he was not a man you could comfort with a lie. She had learned that much, so she said the true thing instead. She'd not have wanted the room locked, Nell said quietly. I didn't know her, but no woman who played for the kitchen songs to drift up to her would have wanted her music shut in the dark for 7 years to punish a man she loved. That's not grief, Julian. That's a sentence you've passed on yourself, and you've made your daughter serve it with you. He turned from the window and looked at her, and she braced for the granite. It did not come. You are, he said slowly, the rudest woman I have ever met. My father said it was my besetting sin. He also said it might one day be useful to somebody. I begin to think he meant you. The music room was opened the following week. The dust sheets came off the pianoforte, and the windows were thrown up, and the smell of beeswax and old lavender and 7 shut-up years rolled out into the corridor. And Lady Clara stood in the doorway of her mother's music room for the first time in her remembered life and said, "It's enormous," with such profound 7-year-old satisfaction that the footman carrying the dust sheets had to turn his face to the wall. And Nell played. She played the kitchen songs, the ones Susan sang, and Clara sang along in the tuneless, ferocious way of a happy child. And Julian Ashcombe stood in the doorway of the room he had not entered in 7 years, with his hand on the frame, and listened to music in his house, and did not weep, and did not turn to stone. And when Nell looked up at the end and met his eyes across the warm, enormous room, he gave her, deliberately, with effort, like a man lifting something very heavy, half a smile.
It was the first whole half of a smile in 7 years, and it was for her, and they both knew it. And the dowager, who had come up the corridor on her cane to learn what the unprecedented noise was, saw it from the shadow of the doorway, and understood, with the cold, swift accuracy that had made her formidable for 60 years, exactly what was happening in her son's house, and exactly what she was going to do about it. The storm came 2 days later, out of a green sky, the way the bad, late spring storms always did in that country. It had been a soft, warm morning, the kind that made the undergardener whistle on his ladder, and then by 3, the light had gone the colour of a bruise, and the wind came off the moor and laid the young wheat flat in a single long shudder. Nell was at the schoolroom window with Clara when the first rain hit the glass like thrown gravel. She was thinking only that lessons were over for the day, that they might make toast, that the lilacs would be battered. She was not thinking about Tom Carter's little girl, because she did not yet know there was anything to think. The knowledge came up the back stairs in the shape of Susan, white to the lips, with her cap askew.
"Miss! Oh, miss! It's Bess Carter, Tom Carter's youngest, from the home farm. She went out after the ducklings before the rain, and they can't find her. And Tom's gone to the river meadow looking, and Mrs. Carter's in such a state. And there's water coming up in the low field already, miss. Fast."
Nell was on her feet before Susan finished. She did not gasp. She did not wring her hands. She found, in the cold place under her own heart, the thing her father had given her without ever meaning to. The calm of a man who had sat with frightened people his whole life, and learned that fright helps no one.
"How old is Bess?" she said.
5, miss. Same as near Lady Clara's age. Right. Nell was already pulling on her stout boots, the ones she'd been mocked for bringing. "Clara, you will go to Mrs. Pell, and you will stay with her, and you will be brave, because I need to know exactly where you are, so I needn't worry about you. Can you do that for me?" Clara, who had her father's nerve under the grey eyes, nodded once and went. "Susan, lanterns, as many as the still room has, and the stable ones too. Send a boy to ring the chapel bell. 3 strokes, pause, 3 strokes, over and over, so that if she can hear anything she'll hear that, and know to come toward it, and so the men in the fields know to come back to the house and not scatter. Go!" She came down into the great hall, pinning her wet hair back with one hand. And that was where the Duke found her. Not the groom now, not Mr. Ashby. The Duke of Ravenstone, in his own hall, come down at the noise with his face like the weather outside.
"What has happened?" he said. She told him in 6 sentences, flat and exact. The child, the field, the rising water, the bell, the lanterns coming. She did not soften it, and she did not let it run away into panic. He watched her do it, and something shifted in his face. Not fear, though he was afraid. Recognition. He had spent 7 years among people who managed him, who arranged their faces, who treated the house like a sick room. Here was a woman treating a crisis like a thing that could be solved. "What do you need?" he said. It was, she would think later, the most romantic sentence anyone had ever said to her, and there was not a particle of love in it. Only trust. "Men, in pairs, each pair with a lantern, working the low field outward from the duck pond, in lines, not running, calling her name and then stopping to listen. The water will have driven her uphill. Children go uphill from water without being told. It's the one mercy. The old ice house in the spinney. The folly. The dry culvert under the carriage drive. Any place small and roofed. She's 5 and she's frightened, and she'll have gone to ground somewhere she feels hidden, not somewhere she can be seen. We look for hiding places, not for a child in the open. You've done this before. My father's parish flooded every second spring. I found 4 lost children and helped bury. She stopped, and did not say it, and he saw her not say it. I have found 4. I should like to make it 5. Lanterns, Your Grace. We're wasting light. And the Duke of Ravenstone, who gave orders for his living, took them from the vicar's daughter in wet boots, and was glad to. They went out into it together. He would not be left behind in the house, and she did not waste breath telling him to. The rain was coming sideways, and the chapel bell had begun its 3 and 3 over the roar of the wind, and the low field was already a black sheet of standing water, throwing the lantern light back up at them. Nell took the spinney, because the spinney was where she would have gone at 5. She went methodically, calling and stopping, the way you taught your own fear to behave. And the Duke came at her shoulder with the lantern held high, and twice he started to call out wildly, and twice she put her hand on his arm and said, "Stop! Listen!" And they listened, and heard only water. It was at the ice house that she heard it. A small sound under the bell, under the wind. Not a cry, which was the thing that frightened her most, but a hiccuping, exhausted, going quiet sound. The sound a child makes when it has cried itself nearly out. The ice house door had blown half off its hinge years ago, and no one had mended it. And inside, on the dry stone shelf above the old melt drain, wedged into the furthest dark corner with her arms around her knees, was Bess Carter, soaked through and grey-lipped and past speaking, but breathing and whole and alive. "There now," said Nell, going down on her knees on the cold stone, as though she had all the time in the world and not a care beyond this child. "There now, Bess. You clever, clever girl, to get up out of the wet. The cleverest girl in the whole county. I've come to take you home, and your mother is going to be so cross with you for frightening her, which is how you'll know how much she loves you." And she got her coat around the child, and the child's frozen face into her warm neck, and stood and turned, and the Duke was filling the broken doorway with the lantern, and his face was doing something it had not done in 7 years, in front of another living soul. He was looking at the warm, mud-streaked, soaked-through woman with a saved child in her arms, as though he had never in his life seen anything he wanted so much. They got Bess home to a fire and a frantic mother and a father who could not stop shaking the Duke's hand and calling him "Your Grace" and weeping. Nell stood back in the steam and the candlelight of the home farm kitchen and let the family have their child. And the Duke came and stood beside her, the rain still running off both of them onto the flagstones. And for a while neither of them said anything at all. "You said 4, he said at last, very low, under the noise of the Carter's joy. "Before, you said you had found 4 and you stopped." "The 5th I did not find in time, a long while ago. I was younger than I am now, and I have never quite forgiven the river for it." She looked at the Carter child, pink now, bawling now, gloriously alive. "5, she said. "It's 5 now. Thank you for the lantern, Your Grace." "Julian," he said. "Julian," she agreed, too tired to fight it, and did not see, because she was watching the child, the way he looked at her in that kitchen, like a man who has finally, after a long winter, found something he means to keep. The story of that night went round the estate before the water had even gone down off the low field, the way such stories do, growing a little in the telling and needing no help to do it. By the next market day, it was known in the village that the new governess at Ravenstone had walked out into the worst storm of the spring
and brought Tom Carter's Bess home alive out of the old ice house, and that the Duke himself, the Duke who had not been seen at church, nor market, nor any gathering of his own people in 7 long years, had gone out into it at her shoulder, and carried the lantern and done as she bid him, like any man, like a neighbour. The tenants turned it over among themselves, with the slow satisfaction of people who have waited a long time for a thaw. They told it at the forge, and over the churchyard wall, and across the low hedges between one man's land and the next, and each in the telling found some small new thing to wonder at. The calm of her, the boots of her, the way she had set the bell ringing so the lost child might steer by the sound of it. They had loved the young Duchess, and grieved the loss of her, and grieved almost as much the loss of the master who had gone into the ground with her in everything but body. Now here was warmth come back into the great house from an unlooked-for quarter, and they were country people who knew the worth of a kind spring after a hard winter, and they did not need to be told what they were watching, nor whose side they were on when the trouble came, as the wiser among them knew quite well it must. "I have invited the Earl of Carlisle and his daughter to dine on Saturday," the Dowager announced at breakfast. The Duke had begun to take breakfast in company, another small resurrection, in the tone of a general announcing a position already taken. "Lady Seraphina. You will remember her, Julian. She has grown into a very elegant young woman. It is time, my dear, and past time, that this house had a duchess again." The Duke set down his cup. "Mother." "Do not mother me. The estate wants an heir. Clara wants a—" The Dowager's eyes flicked deliberately toward the door, through which the governess had just carried the child's breakfast tray. "Wants a mother of her own rank, and not a substitute who will leave the moment a better position offers. I have done you the courtesy of choosing a girl of sense and fortune and the proper birth, who will not embarrass you, and who understands, as you and I understand, that marriage at our level is a matter of land and lineage and not of—" She paused, and the pause was a scalpel. "Not of the servants' hall. Saturday. You will be present. You will be charming, insofar as you remember how, and you will give Lady Seraphina every reason to think well of an alliance. I have not asked you for one thing in 7 years, Julian. I am asking you for this." And the terrible thing, Nell, pausing in the corridor with the empty tray, heard the whole of it through the door she had no business listening at. The terrible thing was that the Dowager was not wrong. That was what made it unbearable. A duke must marry his own kind. A duke must have an heir. A governess was a governess. Every word of it was the plain, hard truth of the world Nell had been born to the bottom of, and she had known it from the first cracked moment in the gallery, and she had let herself, in the warm, thawing weeks since, half forget it. She stood in the corridor with the tray and let the truth come back into her like cold water, and did not let one drop of it show on her face when she carried the tray down to the kitchen, where Susan was singing. The dinner was a battlefield, and Nell was not even meant to be on it, which somehow made the wounds worse. She was not invited, of course. Governesses do not dine with earls. But Clara, fractious and clinging, and certain in the way of children that something bad was coming, would not go to sleep. And so Nell was summoned to the small parlour adjoining the great dining room to keep the child quiet, which meant she sat with Lady Clara on her lap in the half-dark and heard, through the imperfectly closed door, every elegant cruelty of the evening. She heard Lady Seraphina Vane, whose voice was beautiful the way cut glass is beautiful, all bright edges. She heard the Dowager steering. She heard the Duke being, against every instinct she now knew he possessed, charming, short and careful and correct, and each correct, charming sentence he spoke to the Earl's daughter was a small, precise stone laid on Nell's chest. She told herself she had no right to the weight of them. She told herself she had known all along. She held the Dowager's grandchild and told herself a great many true things, none of which made it hurt less. And then she heard her own name.
"The governess," Lady Seraphina was saying, in the carrying voice of a woman who does not greatly care who hears her. "Carlisle people had it from the village. A vicar's daughter, dismissed from her last post. Some unpleasantness, one gathers, with the master of the house." There was no unpleasantness. Mrs. Pell's account, given to Nell weeks later, had the Duke's voice going very quiet here. The quiet that the footman had learned to fear, and Nell, hearing it told, would know exactly where he had come by what he said next, because she had set it in his hands herself, one quiet schoolroom afternoon. Miss Hart left her last post because the master of the house made advances she declined, and the wife dismissed the woman rather than the husband, as wives are taught to. The unpleasantness, Lady Seraphina, was not hers. A silence in the dining room. The clink of a glass set down. "How warmly you defend your servants, Your Grace," said Lady Seraphina, and the bright edges of her voice had a new note in them, a note Nell knew, the note of a woman who has just located the soft place and intends to put her thumb in it. "One hopes the staff appreciate it, though I confess I find it a little—" a delicate pause. "A little eccentric, to know quite so much of a governess's history. In my father's house we should not know the name of the woman who teaches the children, let alone her romances." "Then your father's house," said the Duke, "is poorer than I had supposed." The Dowager's voice came in over the top of it, fast and bright and furious, smoothing, redirecting. And Nell sat in the dark with the sleeping child grown heavy in her arms, and understood two things at once, and with perfect clarity. The first was that Julian Ashcombe had just defended her, a governess, to an earl's daughter, across his own dinner table, at the cost of the alliance his mother had spent the winter building. That he had chosen her honour over his interest, in front of witnesses, without hesitation. The second was that this was precisely why she had to go. Because a man who would do that was a man who could be ruined by what he felt for her, and she would not be the thing that ruined him. And the only way to be sure she was not was to take herself out of the house before the feeling, on either side, grew strong enough to do real damage to a man who had already lost more than anyone should. She put Clara to bed. She sat at the schoolroom table in the low fire and wrote, in her father's careful hand, a letter of resignation. She gave a fortnight's notice, which was correct. She thanked the family for the position, which was gracious. She said nothing of any of the true things, because the true things were not hers to say to a duke. And she sat with the finished letter in front of her and did not cry, because she had been poor and proud her whole life, and crying had never once mended anything. And she thought, this is the cost of letting the window open. You feel the warm day, and then it ends, and the cold afterward is worse than if you had never felt it at all. Father, you never told me that part. But before she could give him the letter, and this was the cruelty of the way things fall out, that she had decided to be wise, and the world did not give her the day she needed to be wise in. Before she could give him the letter, the morning came that was, for one shining hour, the best of her life, and the Dowager chose it, with the unerring instinct of a woman who knows that the deepest cut is the one delivered to the happiest flesh, to make her move. It had rained in the night and cleared, and the lilacs had opened. That was the first thing, that the long dark hedge that had been tight green buds the day she arrived had broken overnight into bloom, and the whole of the south garden was drowned in the scent of it, sweet and heavy and almost too much, the smell of a spring that has finally, fully arrived. Clara had gone mad with it. Clara had to be out in it, and so the three of them were in the garden in the early morning before the Dowager was down, the Duke in his shirt-sleeves, because he had been helping the undergardener move a fallen branch the storm had brought down, and had not bothered to put his coat back on, and Nell with her hair coming loose, and Clara running shrieking down the lilac walk with her arms out like a small mad bird. She'll exhaust herself before her lessons, Nell said. Let her. The Duke watched his daughter run. The morning light was on his face. She has 7 years of running to make up. So I begin to think, have I? He bent and picked a single sprig of lilac and turned it in his fingers, and Nell watched him do it, the broad, careful hands she had noticed in the first hour. And she thought, I'm going to give him a letter this afternoon, and I'm going to watch this end. So let me at least have this minute. Let me be greedy for 1 minute. And the wanting of it was so sharp it was almost grief. You're going to say something rude, the Duke observed, not looking at her. I have learned your face. You go quiet just before, like a cat before it knocks something off a shelf. I was going to say, Nell said, that you very nearly look happy, Your Grace, and that it suits you better than the gloom, and that if you tell a soul I said so, I shall deny it, and correct your Latin in front of the bishop. And Julian Ashcombe turned the lilac in his fingers, and looked at the governess with her hair coming down in his mother's garden, in the smell of his lost wife's favourite flower. And he smiled. Not half a smile, not the ruin of one. The whole thing, slow and disbelieving, and 7 years deep, breaking over his face like the first real warmth after a winter that had lasted too long, transforming him so completely that Nell actually took a step back, because she had not known, she had genuinely not known, that the granite man from the gallery had a face like that underneath, young and alight and unguarded and so beautiful in his plain, ordinary happiness that her own breath went out of her. There, he said softly. You see? You can do that. The rudest woman in England, and she can do that. He held out the sprig of lilac. When the lilacs come out next year, he said, I'm going to remember this exact morning, and I'm going to— Julian. She did not take the lilac. She could not. Don't. Why not? Because you can't finish that sentence, and I can't bear to hear you try. Her voice was steady. It cost her everything she had. There's no next year for me here. You know there isn't. I knew it in the gallery the day she came. You knew it at your own dinner table on Saturday, when you spent your mother's whole winter's work to defend a governess, and felt for 1 second how easy it would be to throw the rest after it. We are not. Julian, we are not a thing the world will let happen. And the longer we pretend in this garden, the worse it will be when the world reminds us. And the world always reminds us. It is the one thing the world never forgets to do. He stood with the lilac held out between them. The smile was going. She watched it go, and watching it go was worse than the gallery, worse than the dinner, worse than anything. Then we make it happen anyway, he said. Now, I'm a duke. If a duke cannot, a duke least of all, she said. A duke has the most to lose, and the least freedom to lose it, and you know that better than I do. You've known it since you were a boy. Don't ask me to be the thing that costs you your name. I've nothing of my own, Julian. No fortune, no name, no rank, nothing in the world but myself. And a woman who has only herself cannot afford to give it where it will be despised. Let me go while it's only a bruise. Please. Let me go before it's a wound. And it was then. Of course it was then. The Dowager had been watching from the morning room window for a quarter of an hour, waiting for the precise moment. It was then that Augusta, Dowager Duchess of Ravenstone, came down the garden steps on her cane with the folded paper in her gloved hand and the light of a battle she intended to win in her cold, beautiful face. Miss Hart, she said, how fortunate. I was about to send for you. She held out the paper. It was Nell's own letter of resignation, taken from the schoolroom where Nell had left it, by a maid or by the Dowager's own hand. It did not matter which. I find you have saved us all a great deal of awkwardness. You have resigned. Very proper. I have taken the liberty of accepting on the family's behalf and arranging the carriage. It leaves at noon. The cold eyes moved to her son and softened not at all. Lady Seraphina and her father remain another 2 days, Julian. You will spend them making amends for Saturday. I have given my word to the Earl of Carlisle, and I do not intend to be made a liar by a vicar's daughter and a bunch of flowers." She let the word fall with exquisite contempt onto the lilac in her son's hand. Mel took her own letter from the dowager's glove. Her hand was perfectly steady.
"Thank you, Your Grace," she said. "Noon will do very well."
And she turned and walked back up the lilac walk to fetch Clara and pack her trunk. And behind her, she heard nothing at all. No sound from the Duke, no sound from his mother. Only the early birds and the heavy, sweet weight of the lilacs. And she did not look back, because if she looked back, she would not be able to do the next part, and the next part had to be done. She believed walking up that path, every word she had said to him in the garden. That was the heart of it. She believed she was sparing him. She believed a duke would, in the end, choose his name and his estate and his mother's word and the earl's daughter, because that was what dukes did. That was what the whole machinery of the world was built to make them do. And the kindest thing she could do for the warm, broken man she had, she made herself think the word, in the privacy of her own packing, because she would not lie to herself even now. The man she had loved, the kindest thing she could do for him, was to take herself out of his way before he ruined himself reaching for her. He had grabbed the first warm hand in the water, she told herself, folding the green ribbon away. That was all it had ever been. A drowning man and a warm hand. He would find the bank again without her. He had a daughter, and a name, and a duty, and a beautiful, suitable, elegant girl chosen by his mother. And he would, in a year, in 2, be glad. She made herself believe he would be glad. That the governess had had the sense to leave before she became a scandal in the village, and a crack in the foundation of his house. She had been a season's warm spell, she told herself, nothing more. The frost would come back, and he would forget the brief, unseasonable warmth of her. And that was right. That was as it should be. That was the world working as the world worked. She did not know. She had walked up the path and could not see it. That behind her in the lilac walk, the Duke of Ravenston was standing very still, with a sprig of lilac in his hand, and his mother's voice in his ears, and was discovering, at the age of 28, that there was one thing in the world he wanted more than his own grief, and that he had very nearly let it get into a carriage at noon. The carriage was at the door at 11:45. Nell's trunk was on it. Clara had been told, and had not cried, which was worse than crying. She'd gone white and silent and old, the schooled silence of a child who has learned that the people you love leave, and that making a noise about it changes nothing. And she had hugged Nell once, hard, with her face pressed into Nell's neck, and then she had let go, and stepped back, and stood very straight beside Mrs. Pell, with her small chin up. And Nell had thought, that is the thing I will not forgive myself. I taught her to laugh, and now I have taught her this, and had nearly broken, and had not, because breaking in front of the child would only make the child's lesson crueler. The dowager was on the steps to see her off, which was a courtesy and a triumph, and a warning all at once. Of the Duke there was no sign. Nell told herself that was a mercy. She had said her goodbyes to him in the garden, in the only honest words either of them would ever be allowed. A second parting on the steps in front of his mother and the servants would be a performance, and she had played enough parts in the great house already. She had her foot on the carriage step when the door of the house opened behind her, and the Duke of Ravenstone came out, and he was not alone, and he was not dressed for a parting. He was dressed for war, properly dressed for once, every inch the Duke, and behind him in the doorway, drawn out by the unprecedented sight of the Master of Ravenstone in a towering, quiet rage, came the whole household, and behind them, alarmed, the Earl of Carlisle and Lady Seraphina Vane in her mourning silk. "Take her trunk down," the Duke said to the footman. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He never had. "Miss Hart is not leaving." "Julian," The dowager began.
Mother, you will hear me, and you will hear me in front of these witnesses, because I have spent 7 years letting you arrange my silence, and I find I have come to the end of it. He came down the steps.
He had the sprig of lilac still in his hand. Nell saw it, absurdly, the small, wilting thing he had not put down in 2 hours. You said you had not asked me for one thing in 7 years. That is true. But you are mistaken about what you asked. You did not ask me to marry. You asked me to go on being a ghost, a duchess of the proper birth, an heir, an alliance, all of it, so that the machine could go on running and no one would ever again have to see me feel anything. And I agreed. For 7 years I agreed, because feeling nothing was easier than feeling what I felt. And you were kind enough to call my absence duty, and let me hide inside the word. "This is hysteria," said the dowager, but her voice had lost an edge, and her eyes had gone, just once, to the lilac in his hand. "This is the opposite of hysteria. This is the first sane thing I have said in 7 years. He turned to Nell. The whole household watched.
Lady Seraphina watched with her bright glass face gone perfectly blank. You told me in the garden that you have nothing in the world but yourself. You said a woman who has only herself cannot afford to give it where it will be despised. His voice did not shake. The grey eyes were open all the way down, and what was at the bottom of them was not grief now. It was certainty. The terrible, bright certainty of a man who has finally stopped weighing the cost. Eleanor Hart, I despise nothing about you. I have a name, and land, and rank, and a daughter, and the whole apparatus of consequence my mother is so eager to protect. And I would set every particle of it on the carriage with your trunk, and watch it drive away, before I would let you go up that lane, believing you were a season's warm spell to me. You are not the warm hand a drowning man grabbed. You are the shore. I have been swimming toward you since the morning you handed me your bandbox, and called it confusion, because I had forgotten that the feeling had a name. Stay. Not as the governess. Stay because I am asking you, in front of my mother and an earl and every servant in this house, and my daughter who loves you, to do me the very great honor, Nell, of refusing to get into that carriage. The garden was silent. The lilacs poured their scent over the whole impossible scene. And Eleanor Hart, Vicar's daughter, who had been rude to a duke in a stable yard, and corrected his Latin, and taught his daughter to laugh, and resolved, not 2 hours since, to spare him by leaving, looked at the man standing in front of his entire household, with a wilting sprig of lilac in his hand, and his whole name laid down on the gravel between them, and found that all her good, wise reasons had gone out of her like air from a bladder, leaving only the plain, unbearable truth that she did not want to be spared, and neither, it turned out, did he. Well, she said. Her voice was not steady at all now, and she did not care. Since you ask so prettily, and since you've made an absolute spectacle of us both, Your Grace, in front of the entire county, which I shall be reminding you of for the rest of our lives. For the rest of our lives, he agreed. Then no, said Nell. I will not get into the carriage. And she stepped down off the carriage step, and Clara made a sound like a small kettle coming to the boil, and shot across the gravel and hit them both at knee height, and the Duke caught the child up with one arm and reached for Nell with the other, and the lilac got crushed somewhere between the three of them, and nobody minded. The dowager did not faint, because dowagers of her vintage do not faint. They reassess. She stood on the steps and watched her granite son hold a governess and a child and a ruined sprig of lilac in the morning light. Watched him laugh, out loud, the sound of it cracking across the garden like ice going out of a river in spring. And she put one gloved hand to the head of her cane and gripped it, and on her cold, beautiful face there moved something complicated that none of the watching servants could read. She turned and went into the house alone. It was 3 days before she made her move. And her move was not the one anyone expected. The Earl of Carlisle had departed within the hour, taking his daughter and his bright glass voice and his alliance with him. Lady Seraphina, to her modest credit, had looked at the scene in the garden, looked at her own reflection in the situation, and decided, with the swift self-interest of the truly elegant, that she had no wish to marry into a house where the Duke made such public cattle of himself over the help, and had said so, in those words, and had gone. The Dowager had let them go without a fight, which was the first sign that something in her had shifted, though no one in the house dared hope it. She kept to her rooms. The household, giddy and terrified, walked on eggshells around the master's happiness, certain the Dowager was preparing some final stroke.
Nell, who had agreed to stay but had not yet agreed to anything as outrageous as the thing the Duke clearly intended, and who knew the Dowager's power better than the love-struck Duke seemed to, waited for the blow, with the wariness of a woman who has been poor and knows that the world's reminders always come. It came on the third evening, but it did not come as a blow. The Dowager sent for the governess. Nell went, alone, having refused the Duke's offer to come with her. "If she means to fight me, Julian, she'll do it cleaner without an audience, and I'd rather know her measure." And found the old woman, not in the grand drawing-room where battles were fought, but in the small private sitting-room that had been, Nell understood the moment she entered it, the late Duchess's. It smelled of lavender. There was a work-basket by the chair, with 7-year-old embroidery still in it, the needle still threaded, the way a room keeps the shape of a person who has only just left it. The Dowager was sitting by the window with something small in her hand. She did not look up at once. When Nell came close, she saw that it was a miniature, a painted oval, the kind a family keeps, and that the Dowager's thumb was moving across the painted face on it, slowly, back and forth, as though she had forgotten she was doing it. The face in the miniature was a young woman's, laughing, with a quantity of dark hair badly suited to the formal pose, as though the painter had begged her to be still, and she had not managed it. "My daughter-in-law," the Dowager said, still not looking up. "Cassandra." She could not sit still to save her life. "The man charged me 40 guineas for this, and complained the whole while that she would keep laughing." Her thumb moved across the painted face. "I did not choose her, you understand. Julian's father and I had chosen quite another girl, suitable, well-born, cold. And Julian, at 21, came home from a friend's house and announced he was going to marry a baronet's daughter, with no fortune, and a laugh you could hear from the stables. And his father raged for a month, and I—" She stopped. "I told him he was throwing himself away. I used very nearly the words I used to you in the garden. Land and lineage, not the servants' hall. And then she came into this house, and she opened the music room, and she made my granite son laugh. And within a 12-month I loved her better than I have ever loved any soul on this earth, excepting him. And I never once told her so, because I am the woman you met in the gallery, and women like me do not say such things. We believe it is weakness. We believe the cold is dignity." She looked up at last. Her eyes were dry, but they were old and tired, in a way Nell had not seen in the gallery. "And then we lost her," the Dowager said. "In 4 days, while he was in London thinking there was time. And I watched my son turn to stone over her grave. And I told myself it was grief, and that grief was proper, and that the stone was a kind of faithfulness. And I let him stay stone for 7 years, Miss Hart. I arranged his stone. I called it duty, and I called the alliance with Carlisle duty, and I told myself I was protecting the house. And the truth I have been sitting in this room with for 3 days, holding her picture, is that I was protecting myself. Because if Julian were allowed to be happy again, then the cold I have called dignity my whole life would stand revealed as what it is, which is fear. And I could not bear to be the only frozen thing in a thawing house." The room was very quiet. Outside, the lilacs were dark against the last of the light. "I came down to that garden 3 days ago," the Dowager said, "to put you in a carriage.
because you frightened me more than any woman has frightened me since she did. You have her trick of it, the laugh, the rudeness, the way you make him. Her voice did the smallest thing and steadied. I have spent 3 days deciding whether to destroy you, Miss Hart. I have the means. You know I have the means. A word in the right ears, a question about your last position, and you would never hold a respectable post in England again. And Julian, for all his fine speeches, could not entirely undo it. She set the miniature down on the small table between them, deliberately, where Nell could reach it, the painted, laughing face turned up. I have decided not to. I find, at 61, that I would rather not spend whatever years are left to me being the villain in my own son's story. She would be ashamed of me. She is the only person whose shame I ever feared, and she has been gone 7 years, and I find she frightens me still. She reached into the work basket, past the threaded needle, past the 7-year-old embroidery, and drew out a folded paper, sealed, and laid it beside the miniature. This is a settlement, the Dowager said. In my own hand, witnessed this afternoon by Mrs. Pell and the steward. It settles upon you, on the day you marry my son, the income of the dower lands that come to me, mind, mine to give, which makes you, on that day, a woman who comes to her husband with something of her own, which I believe were your words in the garden. A woman who has only herself cannot afford to give it where it will be despised. You will no longer have only yourself. And no one in this county, Miss Hart, will dare despise a woman the Dowager Duchess of Ravenstone has chosen to dower. That much my coldness is good for. Let it, for once, be good for something. Nell looked at the folded settlement, and the laughing miniature beside it, and the old woman's hands, which were not quite steady. She did not pick up the paper at once. She had learned, in a hard school, to be careful of gifts from the powerful. "Why," she said, the same word she had given the Duke in the corridor, the only word that ever mattered. "You could have simply suffered me, Your Grace, tolerated the misalliance with a cold face, and let the county talk. This is more than tolerance. Why?" The Dowager Duchess of Ravenstone looked at the governess for a long moment. "Because 3 nights ago," she said, "I stood in the door of the music room, the room I, too, have not been able to enter in 7 years, and I heard my granddaughter sing. Badly, with her whole heart, the way her mother sang. And I understood that you had given my house back the one thing my own coldness took out of it, and that a woman who would do that, dowry or no dowry, vicar's daughter or no, is worth 10 Lady Seraphinas, and the whole earldom of Carlisle thrown in." She picked up the miniature again and pressed it once, briefly, to her lips, an old woman's gesture, private and unbearable, and set it down. "Take the paper, child, and do me one kindness in exchange, since we are bargaining, you and I, as women of sense. When you are mistress here, teach the old woman in the dower house how it is done. The laughing, I have forgotten. I should like, before the end, to remember." And Eleanor Hart, who had walked into that lavender-smelling room braced for a blade, came around the small table and did the thing no one had done to the Dowager Duchess of Ravenstone in 20 years, which was to take both the old cold hands in her own warm ones and hold them and say, "Well, we'll start with the lilacs. They're easiest. Even a duchess can manage a lilac." And the Dowager laughed, a rusty, cracked, astonished sound, a laugh that had not been used in so long it had merely seized solid, and pressed the warm hands once, hard, and looked away out the window so that the governess should not see her face. And Nell let her look away, because she understood by now that there are people who can only be kind in profile, and that loving them means letting them keep the small dignity of not being watched while they thaw.
They were married in the village church in June, when the lilacs were over and the roses had come, by a curate who had known Nell's father and wept all through the service and married them anyway. It was not a grand wedding. The Duke had offered St. George's, Hanover Square, and the whole machinery of consequence, and Nell had said she would rather be married in the church where her father had preached, by a man who had known him, in front of the village and the household, and one rusty laughing dowager, and the Duke, who had learned in 3 months that the fastest way to make his wife look at him the way she had looked at the groom in the stable yard was to let her be rude to him and then give her exactly her own way, had agreed at once. Clara carried the ring on a cushion and dropped it twice. Mrs. Pell cried into a tablecloth-sized handkerchief. Susan sang. And the Duke smiled all the way through it, easily, the way a man smiles who has remembered how and intends to make up for 7 years of arrears. And the village, who had come half for the spectacle of a duke marrying his governess, and half out of love for the vicar's girl, went home and said to one another that they had never seen a gentleman so plainly, foolishly, unfashionably happy, and that it was a scandal, and that they hoped it lasted, and that, between ourselves, it did the cold, great house good to have a laugh in it again. A year after the morning in the garden, the lilacs came out again. They came out overnight, the way they had before, the long hedge breaking from tight green bud into heavy sweet bloom between one evening and one morning. And the Duchess of Ravenstone, who still answered in private to Nell, and who still corrected her husband's Latin, and who had taught the dowager 3 songs, and how to lose at cards to a small child without being obvious about it, came down into the south garden in the early light, and found her husband already there. He was in his shirt sleeves. He had not bothered with a coat. He had a sprig of lilac in his hand, and a daughter at his side, Clara, 8 now, taller, still badly plaited because she fought the brush, fiercely and entirely happy. And when he heard Nell step on the gravel, he turned, and the morning light was on his face, and he smiled at her the way he had not been able to smile at anyone for 7 years, and now could not seem to stop smiling at her, every day, in every room, a man making up his arrears.
You remembered, she said. I told you I would. In this exact garden, when the lilacs come out next year, I'm going to remember this exact morning. He held out the sprig of lilac, and this time she took it. You wouldn't let me finish the sentence. Last year. You said you couldn't bear to hear me try. I was wiser then. I've quite given it up. She turned the lilac in her fingers, the way she'd once watched him do in the first hour, when he was a stranger with a working man's hands and a bishop's voice, and a secret he was keeping in a stable yard. Finish it then. The sentence. A year late. Mr. Ashby. And Julian Ashcombe, 9th Duke of Ravenstone, who had not smiled in 7 years and now did nothing else, looked at his wife in the garden, in the smell of the lilacs with their daughter turning cartwheels on the wet grass behind them, and finished the sentence at last. I am going to remember this exact morning, he said, and every morning after it, for as long as you'll keep being rude to me, which I hope, Nell, is a very long time. It will be, she said. I've a great deal of it stored up. And she went up on her toes in the wet grass and kissed her husband under the lilacs. And Clara shrieked something deeply unromantic from the lawn. And somewhere up at the house a window opened, and a rusty old voice called down that they would all catch their deaths, and breakfast was getting cold. And the lilacs poured their scent over the warm, full, living house, and not one soul in it was holding its breath.